Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good evening. My name is Nisha Thaplial, and I will be one of your hosts today. We'd like to start by making an acknowledgement to country. We acknowledge the unceded land, waterways, and airways of the many First Nations on which we work, study, live, and gather for this event, including the traditional custodians of the Dharawal and Kulin nations. We would like to pay our respect to the elders past, present, and emerging. We would like to pay our respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may have joined us today. Hello again, and welcome to this webinar series, Educate, Organize, Resist. My name is Nisha Thaplial. I'm an academic at the University of Newcastle, Australia. And this webinar series came about as part of a research project that I'm doing on social justice activism in the global Indian diaspora. And I won't go into too much detail about that research here, but just to say that in the last 2 years, it's been my honor and privilege to meet some inspiring activists from different walks of life from all over the world in the diaspora. And some of them have very kindly agreed to come and talk to us through this webinar series as well. So that's how this webinar series came about in a nutshell. And it would not have been possible without my colleague, Mudit Vyas. So I'd like Mudit to introduce himself also, please.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mudit. I'm a graduate research student at Monash, and I assist Nisha with this project, a very, very important project in the current context of things. Nisha's already made the acknowledgement of land for the lands we are on. I would like to acknowledge the lands that we come from, the acknowledgement to the people, indigenous people and tribal people of Rajasthan, where I'm from, the Bhil and the Meena people. And I would also like to give one caveat here that we will probably be talking about exclusionary things. And just keep in mind that when we talk about exclusionary ideas and theories, it doesn't necessarily mean we are excluding people who we are questioning or prejudices that we are questioning from human dignity. We are just excluding them from disproportionate access to a lot of ideas and land necessarily. So yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Mudit. Many of you have attended several of our webinars, so you know what we do. But in short, we invite activists, as I've said, who are engaged in collective struggles for human rights, democracy, social justice, and peace across the global Indian diaspora. Today, we're very privileged to have activists with us who don't just engage with issues in India, but the entire South Asian subcontinent. So I'm very feeling very excited about that as well. And we've had many different kinds of conversations. Every webinar is unique. Activists have shared knowledge and wisdom, as well as very practical strategies on what this work involves. But we're all shared in our goal to learn from each other, from the present struggles as well as past struggles against the forces of colonialism, imperialism, and ethno-religious nationalism. We've had, I think I'm losing count now, which is a good thing, but we've had about 6 or 7 webinars. We started with comrades from the US and the UK talking to us about struggles against Hindu nationalism in those 2 countries or contexts. And we also had a very interesting conversation about educating for solidarity in the United States using the example of the Youth Solidarity Summers. And more recently, our webinars have focused on the monster of caste oppression. As Baba Saheb Ambedkar warned us, when Indians migrate to other regions, Indian caste would become a world problem, and so it is and has been. Baba Saheb also taught us that this is not just a problem of one group. We're all slaves of the caste system, but we're not equal in the system. But our liberation is tied up in each other's liberations. We're only as free as our fellow human beings and our fellow living beings are. So we've been very fortunate, again, to have some really inspiring activists share with us the way they approach these struggles. We had a panel discussion with activists right here in Australia. And then we had the Anti-Caste Discrimination Alliance from the UK a few months ago. And most recently, we had the Equality Labs and then Maurice Soundarajan talking to us about the US context. And with Mudit's help, this is entirely Mudit's work, we are slowly editing and putting these videos up on YouTube so that people can continue to watch and use them for educational purposes. Every time a video goes up, we try and email everyone on our mailing list. But if you'd like, the best way to keep up to date is, of course, to subscribe to our YouTube channel, which is EOR_AU. So it's my great honor and privilege today to welcome South Asia Solidarity Group, which is an anti-imperialist, anti-racist organization based in the United Kingdom. They have been working there for over 4 decades. I think Kalpana and Keval, you must be close to a 50th anniversary. I've sort of known about your work since I left India almost 3 decades ago. So this is one, how does one do justice to 4 decades of work? We can't. And where they will be telling us a little bit about how the organization started, a little bit of the history, but we would very much encourage you to go to their excellent website where much of the work is documented. And as you can see from this slide, they've done everything from bring out their own magazine to, of course, organizing protests on the street and meetings and keeping British and international media informed about issues in India, as well as issues faced by South Asians in Britain. And I was particularly interested when I first got to know Kalpana about the 1857 exhibition, which they created because I teach about these things, but it's always really interesting for me when I hear activists talking about how they use history as an educational tool to raise awareness, and to share, because we've all been miseducated to a large extent, haven't we, about our own history because of colonialism and other factors. So there's just so much to learn about. The key, I think their work is organized around working in solidarity with people's movements, not just in India, but across South Asia, as well as people's movements in Britain, around issues of human rights, social justice, neoliberalism, imperialism. And I think what I find particularly inspiring about their work is how they manage to make these connections between the economic and the cultural and the political. And we're about to learn some of that from them today. They have requested that we start by watching a short video about one of their most recent campaigns. And then I'll briefly introduce our speakers for today, Kalpana and Keval, and then we'll get started. So fingers crossed that this video works.
कब तक झेलेंगे ये काली रातें और ढकेले तुम्हें वापस जाओ 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 कूचे कूचे से गूंजे हैं नारे ऐ जालिम वापस जाओ 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 हम सब मिलकर अब करते ऐलान है, हम ठुकराते तुम्हें वापस जाओ जाओ जाओ, बुलंद आवाज़ें सुनकर वो कांपे, मिलकर चिल्लाओ वापस जाओ जाओ जाओ, जब तक है बाकी सीने में दम, गाएंगे ऐ जालिम वापस जाओ जाओ जाओ, फिर लहराएगी लाल गगन में तेरे इरादों की राख, वापस जाओ जालिम जाओ वापस।
So thank you for reminding us about this beautiful video that I believe Keval produced. And this song, of course, many of you will recognize. It's a very old song. It comes out of, I think it's almost 150 to 100 years old. Originally, it comes out of a protest by Italian peasants. Bella Ciao, they sang this in their paddy fields to protest against, slave-like working conditions. Then it was sung by anti-fascist activists who took on Mussolini and Hitler during World War II. And from then on, it's become an anti-fascist revolutionary anthem that's been translated into many languages, including our own. And Kalpana just reminded me that this was also sung at the anti-CA protests in Hindi. And of course, we know it was recently sung at the farmers' protests in Punjabi. So thank you for sharing that with us. It's now my pleasure to introduce two members of South Asia Solidarity Group who will be speaking with us today. Kalpana Wilson is an anti-racist feminist, left activist based in London. She teaches international development at Birkbeck, University of London. Her research explores questions of race, gender, labor, neoliberalism, imperialism, and reproductive rights and justice, with a particular focus on South Asia and its diasporas. She is the author of Race, Racism, and Development, Interrogating History, Discourse, and Practice. And for anyone who's here today who teaches about aid or seeks to educate about not only the political economy of Western aid, but now the nexus between the aid machines, shall we call them, of Hindu nationalism and specifically Seva International. I strongly recommend reading some of Kalpana's blogs and shorter articles on this topic as well. Kalpana, I'm using one of yours in the course that I'm just finishing up teaching this semester. It was a very accessible educational resource, so thank you. Our second speaker today is Keval Bharadia. He is also an activist and a political economist. He has worked in the finance sector for 15 years and is now a radical consultant advising on structural anti-racist and anti-capitalist policies for peace and justice. His recent work includes the development of transformative reparations, policies for slavery, colonialism, and continued imperialism. So we're in for a really interesting 1.5 hours. I'll just, just cover a couple of webinar housekeeping things that we always do for anyone who might be new to our webinar today. Please feel free to start asking your questions right away. We ask that you type them in the Q&A forum so we don't miss them. And you can, of course, continue your conversation in the chat for everything else. Please do know that we are recording, and the recording will be shared with the permission of the speakers on our YouTube channel. We do not live stream it for security reasons, but we will be checking registration for the next few minutes in case you know anyone who's trying to get in at this point. Also for security and privacy, before we publish the video, we edit out audience questions. And by that, we mean we edit out your faces and your voices because many people prefer not to be on camera, and we respect that. So if you're okay with being on camera, let us know and we'll keep you in our final video. But otherwise, please know that we will edit you out for your own privacy and security. So in short, this is a webinar, and that's why you're only going to see 4 faces on screen most of the time. But when it does come to Q&A, if you would like to come on camera, just let us know and we'll change your settings so you can speak directly to our presenters. If you prefer to remain anonymous, we will read out your question for you. So when you post your question, do please clearly let us know whether you want to be on camera or you want us to read your question out for you. And as I've already said, we'll go for about 90 minutes. Our speakers will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll open it up for Q&A from then on. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us today on a Saturday evening. We're all together today to learn from each other. I always like to think of this poem by Savitribai Phule, Rise, Learn and Act. I'm looking forward to learning with all of you. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for your participation, and over to you, Kalpana. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Nisha, for that introduction. And I also want to say a huge thank you to Nisha and to Mudit for organizing this really important and exciting seminar series, and for inviting South Asia Solidarity Group to be part of it. I'd like to say a couple of things to start. First of all, we echo the land acknowledgement made by Nisha and Mudit, and we'd like to extend our greetings to the members of the First Nations of Australia. And we'd also like to say how inspired we are by those who are currently carrying out ceremonies on their traditional lands, which have been handed over to Gautam Adani for coal mining, and to send them our deepest solidarity. And secondly, we want to express our condemnation of the horrific violence against minority Hindus in Bangladesh in recent days, and to call for justice for all those who've suffered. We stand in solidarity with those who Hindus, Muslims, and others who are holding mass rallies at the moment to protest this violence, and who are demanding measures to ensure that this can never happen again. So I'm going to start off by talking a bit about South Asia Solidarity Group, which is an anti-racist, anti-imperialist organization based in the UK, as Nisha said. It was formed back in 1987, and it's been active through some of the really massive changes which have happened in South Asia and here in Britain. So to understand the emergence of the group a bit more, we also have to understand the context it grew out of and some of the specificities of South Asian communities in Britain. So as you may know, after the Second World War, as Britain faced labor shortages, the government invited workers from its colonies and ex-colonies, particularly in South Asia and the Caribbean, to come and do the worst paid jobs under the worst conditions, which basically white British workers were not prepared to do. And of course, we need to think about the economic impacts of colonialism, which also pushed people to migrate. So the formation of South Asian communities in Britain is inextricable from imperialism. Now people came to work in the mills, in the foundries, particularly in the north of England, usually doing the night shifts. In London, they came to staff London Transport as bus drivers and conductors, and to staff the National Health Service, again doing the lowest paid jobs and facing a huge amount of racism. Now in this first phase, which was the 1950s and 1960s, men came from Indian Punjab, who are mainly Sikhs. They came from Kashmir and from Pakistani Punjab, and later also from Bangladesh. And they shared the experiences of migration and of racism. And this common experience meant that people identified as Asians or South Asians. As I said, they faced acute racism from employers, but also from far-right thugs on the streets and from the police. As women increasingly joined them, this was really the catalyst for the establishment of communities where people no longer saw themselves as only temporarily in Britain. And it led to the emergence of organized resistance to racism. So by the 70s, there were a whole range of anti-racist struggles going on against the increasingly restrictive immigration laws which Britain brought in and which divided families in many cases, against the rise of fascist groups like the National Front, against racism in schools. And then also throughout this period, there were workers' strikes and struggles. And I just want to hopefully show you some photos. Okay, so in the 1970s, you had the arrival of Asians from East Africa, who were mainly Gujarati Hindus. And this is particularly important to understand, as this community has been the most important base for Hindutva in the UK. They had played the role of intermediaries or the middle class under British colonialism in East Africa. But they also were not, as is sometimes assumed, mainly affluent when they came to Britain. Many of them came as refugees, and many, particularly the women, had to become factory workers. And in fact, one of the very iconic struggles of the labor movement in Britain was the Grunwick strike, which was a strike of mainly Gujarati East African women workers at a small photo processing factory in North London, which then became a real focus for trade union solidarity. You can see in one of the photographs the miners coming down to the picket line to join the women workers. And there's a lot more about this in Amrit Wilson's book, Finding a Voice, if you want to know more about it. So the other thing to mention at this point is that anti-racist struggles in the 70s and 80s in Britain represented the coming together of Asian and African Caribbean communities against racism. This was the basis of the notion you may have heard of politically Black, which was used in that area, a term which I think is often talked about and misunderstood today. It didn't really relate to individual identity. It was primarily a political strategy of organizing collectively on the basis of shared experiences and common struggles against racism and common histories of imperialism. So while there were, of course, very important differences in experiences, including in Britain, where, for example, Black Caribbean communities were the most targeted by racist policing, and Asians were the most targeted by far-right violence and by racist immigration laws in that period. There were links of solidarity, which also involved activists directly challenging anti-Blackness in South Asian communities. Now, in the 1980s, particularly after the riots or the uprisings, as they're known, by youth against racist policing and violence across many British cities, you had the British state then attempting a new strategy to contain these anti-racist movements. And this was the introduction of multiculturalism. Now, this, of course, tried to shift the discourse from the problem being of structural racism to a focus on diversity. But it was actually more than that. It was a conscious attempt to try and divide people. So funding was offered to community organizations from the state, so long as they agreed to conform to narrow identities. So initially among Asians, it was as Punjabi, Gujarati, or Bangladeshi, and so on, that people were offered funding for community groups. And one of our first publications as SASG was called Asian Culture Black Resistance, and it was an analysis of this. But then in the late 1990s, the notion of faith communities was introduced into this framework by under the Blair government. And this, of course, fitted in with the global shifts in imperialist discourses, the notions emerging of the so-called clash of civilizations and the rise of Islamophobia with the global war on terror. So in this period in the UK, groups were actually being offered state funding for religious identity-based community groups. And this was a tremendous opportunity for Hindutva organizations to gain legitimacy for the notion of Hindu communities, which hadn't really existed before in Britain in the same way, and also to get funding and resources from the state and to speak in the name of the community as its representatives. So local state schools premises, for example, started being used regularly for RSS shakhas for young people in the name of multiculturalism. Funding flowed to Hindu temples, which were brought together under the umbrella of the National Council of Hindu Temples. Hindu student organizations were set up, HSS women's groups. There was also the involvement of ISKCON and its Hare Krishnas, and even yoga and meditation centers became part of the network. And soon we began to see how there was a confluence between Hindutva and the growing Islamophobia of the British state. So in 2007, for example, the Hindu Forum of Britain echoed the love jihad propaganda in India by claiming that, I quote, hundreds of Hindu and Sikh girls were being forcibly converted by Muslim extremists at British universities. And when this was said, you had the Metropolitan Police Commissioner immediately making a commitment to set up a so-called Hindu Safety Forum with aggressive conversion as its top priority. And this was then widely reported in the media. But a few months later, the police were unable to cite a single actual occurrence of even one case. So now coming back to South Asia Solidarity Group and going back a bit, many of us had been involved in these anti-racist movements I talked about. And in the 90s, you had struggles of refugee communities, including Sri Lankan Tamils, becoming a major part of this as well. As a left organization, South Asia Solidarity Group's aim was to link all of these anti-racist struggles in Britain to the contemporary people's struggles for democracy and justice going on across South Asia, which were rarely talked about in Britain. So many of our activities, we had a whole range of different activities, and obviously there isn't time to talk about them here. But they included supporting the movements of landless Dalit and Muslim agricultural laborers in Bihar for land and for dignity and for living wages, and protesting against the horrific violence of the landlord's army and BJP ally, the Ranveer Sena. So we had a series of protests against that outside the Indian High Commission about this. We were actively campaigning on Sri Lanka as well at the time. The human rights activist Rajini Thiranagama, who was assassinated by the LTTE in 1989, had been one of our founder members. We were also engaged in amplifying the Kashmiri people's demands for self-determination from the 90s onwards. We were involved in publicizing the cause of the Chakma people in Bangladesh and highlighting the disappearance of Kalpana Chakma. In Britain, we supported Asian women workers on strike at Burnsells, a car parts factory in Birmingham, and later Gate Gourmet, a company supplying catering to airlines. We campaigned against the 2-year rule, which forced migrant women to stay with violent partners or be deported, and we're involved in many other campaigns. And many of these are documented in our magazine at the time, Inkilab, which we're now archiving on our website. And building anti-imperialist solidarities was always central to our activities. So, for example, we organized a delegation to Belfast in the north of Ireland with other Black and Asian organizations in solidarity with Republican communities there. We were also central to the organization Black People Against War in the Gulf in 1992. After the demolition of the Babri Masjid in 1992, of course, the rise of the Hindu far right became a growing focus of our work and our activities. I should say here that we don't characterize Hindutva as Hindu nationalism. Rather, we see it as a Brahmanical Hindu supremacist fascism. And it's a specific brand of fascism, which is also deeply colonial in origin, and which is today inseparable from the interests of global capital, from imperialist plunder, and from neoliberalism. And Keval is going to talk more about these mechanisms, particularly in relation to British capital. Now, currently, we see our role, on the one hand, as building solidarity with those resisting Hindutva, exposing the fascism of the Modi regime outside India, and continuously challenging Modi's claim that he has the monolithic support of the diaspora. So some of our activities in the last few years have been a series of vigils and marches against mob lynchings, the protests we organized during Modi's visits, our protests against the abrogation of Article 370 in Kashmir. This is actually from a kind of emergency protest, which was called on 5th August 2019 itself. And that is outside the Indian High Commission. In October 2019, we organized a conference called Resisting Fascism, Building Solidarities, India, Kashmir and Beyond. It was very well attended, and the Hindu right also tried to disrupt this. A group of masked protesters burst in, claiming to be activists for LGBT rights, and shouted slogans, "Gay for J&K," which in a very contradictory manner was in support of the abrogation of Article 370 in Kashmir. And I can talk about this whole incident more if people are interested. Now, in January 2020, we worked with the Dalit organization Caste Watch UK, several Indian Muslim organizations, the Indian Workers Association and other groups, and held a several thousand strong national demonstration from Downing Street, which is the Prime Minister's residence, to the Indian High Commission in protest against the Citizenship Amendment Act. And in March 2020, we organized a Shaheen Bagh solidarity block on the Million Women Rise March, which took place for International Women's Day. Now, during the pandemic, we've had a series of events on and offline and social media campaigns as well, including several in solidarity with the farmers' movement, such as a spoof film which we shot outside Hamleys, the historic toy shop now owned by Mukesh Ambani in central London. We've held protests against the Hathras rape and the epidemic of rapes of Dalit women and girls, along with women's organizations. And we held a vigil more recently for Stan Swami outside the High Commission. But equally importantly, we see our role as specifically in countering the activities of the Hindu supremacist groups here in Britain. One of the ways that Hindutva groups operate in Britain is to ensure that in places with large Gujarati Hindu communities, these communities act as vote banks for MPs as long as they continue to demonstrate their sympathies with the BJP and with Hindutva. And this has paid off for them with MPs like Barry Gardner from Brent North and Bob Blackman from Harrow East and others who have turned out to be faithful followers of Modi. Now, Barry Gardner, a Labour MP, visited Gujarat in 2001 to personally present Modi with a check of £1 million collected by an organization called Sewa International, ostensibly for earthquake relief. Now, soon after that, after the Gujarat genocide of 2002, progressive South Asian organizations in Britain exposed Sewa International for diverting these funds to organizations which were directly involved in carrying out the violence. Now, shockingly, again this year, many well-meaning people were sending money for COVID relief through Sewa International, sometimes confusing it with a feminist NGO called Sewa Self-Employed Women's Association, which is, of course, completely different. We've continued to expose Sewa International, most recently by sharing a Channel 4 film from 2002, which shows exactly who they are, and that money given to Sewa International will find its way into the hands of killer gangs. Now, in 2013, Barry Gardner tried to invite Modi to come to the UK. This was before he became Prime Minister. And this invitation was only withdrawn after we organized a protest outside his MP surgery, and there are pictures of that on the screen, along with trade unions and human rights organizations, and then he had to withdraw the invitation. Now, while Barry Gardner is a Labour MP, increasingly the Hindutva groups have affiliated themselves firmly with the Conservative Party in Britain, with the Gujarati community it represents becoming more affluent, and with RSS politics increasingly being espoused by those representing big business, the hedge fund managers and financial analysts, who are epitomized, of course, by those now in the highest echelons of the British government, like Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, or as we call it, the Finance Minister, and Preeti Patel, the Home Secretary. And Keval is going to tell us more about them in his talk. But this affiliation with the Conservatives have become more pronounced when the Labour Party elected Jeremy Corbyn, a veteran left MP and committed anti-racist and anti-imperialist, as its leader. As many of you will know, Corbyn has been a lifelong supporter of the rights of the Palestinian people. Now, after becoming leader of the Labour Party, he was relentlessly hounded by Israel and supporters of the Israeli state who were determined to get rid of him. These groups have worked to effectively outlaw any criticism of Israel in Britain by branding it anti-Semitism, even when it's expressed, as it often is, by Jewish anti-Zionists. Now, this strategy of branding Corbyn's support for Palestine as anti-Semitic was one of the factors which led to his defeat in the 2019 elections and the return of a centre-right leadership of the Labour Party. So what we've seen over the last few years is the Hindutva groups very consciously modeling themselves on the pro-Israel Zionist groups and trying to adopt the same strategies. And of course, this shouldn't surprise us, since despite the important differences between India and Israel, India's relationship with Israel has grown much stronger since Modi came to power. Now, in September 2018, there was a private meeting in the Parliament buildings at the House of Commons in Britain about the law to ban caste discrimination. And some of our members managed to attend this. Now, those present at the meeting included Satish Sharma, the Secretary of the National Council of Hindu Temples, and major Conservative Party donor, Lord Jitesh Gadhia. The Conservative MP Bob Blackman, another outspoken Modi supporter and an Islamophobe in his own right, welcomed Gideon Falter, who is the CEO of the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism, and called for the need to learn from the way Falter had got the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism passed in the Labour Party. This is an extremely controversial definition, which essentially defines criticism of Israel as anti-Semitism. and has been widely criticized. Now, Bob Blackman said in this meeting that he wanted something similar which could prevent criticism of the BJP in Britain. And since then, we're seeing the term Hinduphobia increasingly being used. In Britain, it's been used to attack anyone who talks critically about caste. It's been used to try to sabotage the legislation which has been campaigned for over years by Dalit organizations, which would outlaw discrimination on the basis of caste under equalities laws. And Keval is going to tell us a bit more about that in a moment. And Hinduphobia has been used in the context of the Labour Party passing a motion mildly critical of human rights violations in Kashmir. They too have been accused of Hinduphobia. And it's increasingly been used in the context of any criticism of Modi and the Indian state, as we've seen in the US with the Dismantling Hindutva conference. Now, the assumption that Hindus are somehow under attack is, of course, already being used. It's part of the arsenal of the BJP and its cohorts in India to instigate extreme violence against Muslims and also against Dalits. Now, with the emergence of the notion of Hinduphobia, we're being told that Hindus, both in the UK and globally, are under systematic racist attack and that they deserve justice and protection from progressives, the left, and others committed to fighting anti-Semitism and other kinds of racism. But the point about racism is that it has to have a structural basis. Unlike anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, or anti-Black racism, Hinduphobia has no historical or material basis or background. There have never been any globally dominant structures, laws, or policies like the war on terror, which have attacked or discriminated against people as Hindus. In fact, here in the UK, racism against Indians has always been against so-called Asians as colonized people, and since the 1990s, it's taken the form as well of Islamophobia if we are Muslims or we're assumed to be Muslims. But never have Indians been targeted as Hindus. In the US, pressurized by the Hindu right, the FBI have added anti-Hindu bias as a possible cause of hate crimes. But their statistics published in August this year show that such crimes are negligible, even as attacks on Black people and Asians have escalated. But what about Bangladesh, a Muslim majority country where horrific attacks, as I said at the beginning, are currently taking place on the Hindu minority? As we mourn with those who have lost their loved ones and stand with the many Hindus and Muslims who are protesting against the violence, we must be clear that it's not useful to describe the killings and attacks on temples taking place in Bangladesh as Hinduphobia. Communal and sectarian violence of all kinds, we'd argue, has been endemic in South Asia since the colonial period. And many observers see it as being intensified across the region now by changes like the rise of Hindutva fascism in India and the return of the Taliban in Afghanistan and other things. But this does not make attacks on Hindus into a global phenomenon like Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, any more than the systematic attacks we're seeing on Christians in Pakistan or in India can be called Christian phobia. Now, finally, before I finish, I'd like to say that we need to be very wary of the attempts by the Hindutva groups to appropriate decolonizing rhetoric and represent Hindu supremacism as some kind of decolonial ideology. Now, in the UK, we've seen notions like Orientalism being used by the Hindu right for a while. For example, Prakash Shah, who's one of very few pro-Hindutva academics in Britain, has argued that caste itself is an imaginary Orientalist construct used to demonize Hindus. But more recently, we have Hindutva groups trying very explicitly to project themselves as decolonial. In 2017, there was a conference organized by the RSS called Decolonization of the Indian Mind. And most recently, as some people may know, there was the incident where the leading Latin American decolonial theorist, Walter Mignolo, wrote an endorsement for a book on coloniality by an avowed Sanghi. The book reproduced all the tropes of Hindutva, including the demonization of Muslim and Christian minorities and the rejection of the constitution drafted by Dr. Ambedkar as being representing British colonial Enlightenment values. Now, after an outcry, Mignolo publicly withdrew his endorsement. But the whole episode shows the work that remains to be done to expose the fascism of Hindutva globally. And one thing which I feel we can't emphasize enough when we're having such discussions is the fact that Hindutva itself was never anti-colonial. Its ideologues openly sided with the British and always defined Muslims as the main enemy. Not only that, Hindutva comes out of an understanding of identity and history, which was actually developed and promoted by the British after the 1857 uprisings in particular, in order to try and prevent Hindus and Muslims from uniting again. And we all know that the inspiration for the RSS was Mussolini's black shirts, and we know about MS Golwalkar's admiration for Hitler and his desire to reproduce Hitler's final solution in India. Nor can Hindutva ever be understood as anti-imperialist in the current scenario. They explicitly embrace global capital. They've brought what's being called the new company Raj to India, and they embrace US and Israel-led foreign policy. So I think I've said a lot and talked a lot, so I'm going to leave it there for now. I look forward to the Q&A, and I'm going to hand over to Keval, who's going to talk more about some of these aspects. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Kalpana, for that backstory. And thank you, Nisha and Mudit, for organizing today's important event. And I echo what everyone has said about the respect that we must pay to those that have gone before us and those today fighting against continued imperialism. So my presentation will be slightly shorter and will include a little video clip and a few slideshows as well. But I'm going to be talking mainly about our experiences of working with Dalit groups and human rights activists, various academics, religious and secular organizations on caste discrimination law that was close to becoming part of the Equalities Act here in the UK in 2018. We were required to, or rather the government was required to follow a parliamentary order to put caste into equal rights legislation. But that order was based on a number of human rights reports on the prevalence of caste discrimination in the UK that had been written in the preceding 15 years. But instead of turning it into law, the Conservative Party started a year-long public consultation. The consultation was a smokescreen so they can appease the Hindutva lobby, a strategic voter group and ally in their eyes. The Hindutva lobby had unleashed unwavering support and adulation for the Conservative Party to their members and worshippers for over a decade. The Hindutva lobby made it clear that the Conservative Party is the only party that will protect them and protect them from protect Hinduism. And if one cares about Hinduism, the only vote is a Conservative Party vote. Across the country, Conservative Party supporters would routinely manufacture propaganda that would praise the Conservatives over and against the Labour Party and other liberal parties for being the enemy of Hinduism. So here is a sample of the leaflets that were distributed in highly diverse areas.
Kalpana, maybe you'd like to just talk to that poster we just saw. It's gone off screen, but you probably know it by heart. We'd love to, yeah, please.
Yeah, I mean, basically the leaflet which Keval just showed us shows the way the Hindutva groups made the caste legislation into an election issue or they wanted it to be an election issue. And that poster actually, with the woman with caste stamped on her forehead. Now, this is not, as you might think, a critique of caste. Rather, it's a critique of the idea that anyone should talk about caste. It's saying that it's that which is labeling people and demonizing people and so on. So this, this image of the woman with a baby with caste stamped on her forehead is actually a kind of virulent Brahmanical Hindutva kind of expression. And yeah, I think Keval is going to talk more when he comes back about how that played out in terms of the way that opposition to the caste legislation has been so central to the way the Hindutva groups have been mobilizing in Britain in the last few years. And another thing you might note, if you spotted it on the leaflet, was that it talks about dharmic communities, which is a term which the Hindutva groups here are very fond of using, which they've really coined to refer to try to bring together Hindus, Sikhs, and then it also includes Buddhists, Jains, and others. So this idea that, everyone who is not part of what they, as you know, refer to as an Abrahamic religion somehow has these common interests. Of course, recently, I mean, that's never really worked fully in terms of drawing in Sikhs because of the very different history and the very different kind of identities which people have and the very different struggles which they've gone through. And of course, with the farmers' movement, it's become even more polarized in that way. So that attempt to create this identity of dharmic communities is not particularly successful, but it's one which it's a term they continue to use to try and tell the state, certainly the British state, that, all of these groups have a common interest, which is, they're in many ways portrayed as the kind of the good Asians, not the Muslims and those who are kind of aligned with conservative values, those who are doing well and so on. So I think that's, it very much fits into British racism as well. But I think Keval's back, so I'll hand over.
So I was showing you some leaflets that were produced by the Conservative Party members that had this stamp that you would stamp animals with the caste written on it, projected onto people's foreheads, which is the project that they were trying to do to say that by adding caste discrimination law, we're essentially raising caste consciousness. But what they also did during the consultation was to produce stock answers in template format. And the template answers that pushed aside caste discrimination were distributed far and wide across the network of temples in the UK, reaching thousands of worshippers. We, on the other hand, highlighted reports from previous governments, human rights groups, and the UN on the prevalence of caste discrimination and submitted fresh evidence to no avail. The Conservative Party announced later in 2018 that they will not add caste into equalities legislation, and the case is closed. The decision was roundly criticized by all human rights groups and the UN. The Hindutva lobby welcomed the Conservative government's decision. All recent Conservative Party prime ministers and Preeti Patel have been paraded through the mega temples with garlands and participate regularly in their events. These temples, along with the HSS, the UK arm of the RSS, have charitable status, so are barred from promoting a political party, but routinely do. When the UK Charity Commission investigated the HSS for hate speech in 2014, it meekly and naively suggested the HSS keep away from the RSS. the National Council of Hindu Temples is another key part of the Hindutva lobby. Its Brahmin leader, Satish Sharma, was featured in the 2019 BBC documentary called Hindus, Do We Have a Caste Problem? In it, he claimed that the caste system doesn't even exist. Further, he tried to insinuate that even saying caste is offensive to Hindus and is akin to a black person being called the N-word. We have a short extract from that BBC documentary we can show you today, where Satish Sharma shares his views on caste.
I've come across people that are actually still being discriminated against their caste. How can we as a Hindu community sort of, stop this from happening?
The reality on the ground can be really traumatic for a lot of people. But you said they're discriminated against on the basis of their caste. And I would dispute the use of that word. If I can use a really emotive word which has similar negative connotations, the African-American community, they rejected the word because of the history associated with that word. It was an outrageous, a violent identity which created this word specifically so that even its articulation would make the other person diminished. And this word caste is as toxic for us. There is absolutely no record of a person attending a temple and having been discriminated against on the basis of caste. So if it does exist there and it is discrimination, then it needs to be addressed. We would suggest that the legislation as it already exists is sufficient, because the legislation has got 9 protected characteristics, and those characteristics cover almost every part of these discriminatory events if they happen. But they are not on the basis of caste, because we do not have a hereditary, hierarchical, endogamous structure, nor do we want one.
Having listened to stories of discrimination, it seems clear to me that many Hindus do believe there is a clear caste pyramid. But I don't think banning the use of the word caste will help those Hindus who feel they may be suffering from prejudice.
So Satish Sharma and the Hindutva lobby are working hard to ensure caste is essentially removed from public debate as a word by associating it with negativity in the way that the Israeli lobby have done, to conflate Zionism and the occupation of Palestine with Judaism. Obviously, if caste is not an issue for the Hindutva lobby as claimed, logic would dictate they have nothing to fear and it should be outlawed. The only reason one fears human rights legislation is because abuses and oppression are being committed by people in alliance with the blessing of those yielding power. Satish Sharma and a small number of academics based in the UK are also diligent in producing reams of discourse that frames caste as an entirely colonial project, as Kalpana has pointed out, that they are saying that this has arrived with the British and their Christian missionaries. They're attempting to push this narrative into decolonisation debates, but very much part of the continued project of imperialism. So I'm not sure if it's worthwhile showing, but I will quickly show you 2 recent books by Satish Sharma, which was only published this year, in fact. And in it, this is the person that you saw in the video. And in it, he says, who created the caste system is that the Anglican jihadis of the British Raj created the caste system. The Church of England is both responsible for its existence and to be held accountable. Are they also responsible for manufacturing the concept of untouchables, Dalits, etc.? And Kalpana has already spoken about Prakash Shah, an academic here in the UK, who has produced this book, Western Foundations of the Caste System. And he's quoted here saying, once you go deeper into the study of caste, you realize it's all erected on a false foundation given to Indian culture. So these people and this narrative is shared quite widely amongst worshippers here in the UK across the temple network. Also opposing caste discrimination law is the corporate Hindutva lobby. We're also very tied very closely to the Conservative Party, for they share class interests, of course. The 2 most public groups include the Hindu Forum of Britain and City Hindus. These organizations are home to British Indian billionaire business people, industrialists and financiers. These people play key roles for the British government and international capital by promoting trade and investment on behalf of the UK and India. The City of London's financial district is by many calculations the biggest financial centre on earth, with its huge array of multinational companies headquartered or administered from here, accountancy and legal firms, investment banks and financial markets, insurance industries, private equity, asset management, and hedge funds. Indians are very well represented amongst the financial sector, which is the most prolific donor to the Conservative Party, outstripping donations made by the fossil fuel and energy sector, mining, and industrial sectors. The Hindu Forum of Britain recently wrote an open letter to the relatively new Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer. In it, they reminded the Labour leader that firstly, caste discrimination law is, and I quote, a corrupt piece of legislation being championed by the Labour Party. Secondly, that the previous leader, Labour leader, socialist Jeremy Corbyn, was anti-India because he showed solidarity with the people of Kashmir after India ramped up its occupation there. Finally, and quite ominously, they branded the Labour Party Hinduphobic and that it will target the Labour Party if it continues to meddle with caste, Kashmir, or Hinduism in the way that the Israeli lobby came for the Labour Party when Jeremy Corbyn was leader. The Hindu Forum of Britain also wrote an open letter to the Socialist Campaign Group of Labour MPs for showing solidarity with the occupation in Kashmir. This time it ramped up its threats to be frankly sinister. It said in a letter, in an open letter, that Labour should remember its troubles with anti-Semitism, as Kalpana also mentioned. Anti-Semitism was weaponized by the Israeli lobby in the UK, giving the necessary ammunition to the Conservative Party and mainstream media needed here to ensure Jeremy Corbyn never became Prime Minister. So I would like to end by quoting one line from Babasab's speech to the Railway Workmen's Conference for the Depressed Classes in 1938, 2 years after he gave his annihilation of caste speech. He says in it the following: there are, in my view, two enemies which the workers of this country have to deal with. The two enemies are Brahminism and capitalism. I personally take great inspiration and analytical instruction from this quote. It is Hindutva and capital moving seamlessly across borders by imperial violence that acquires and entrenches power exponentially and interdependently. In order to confront and challenge either, we must hold both to account. I will end by just showing you the graphic of, broadly speaking, the two sides of the Hindutva lobby here in the UK. So this is the slide saying that those that are opposed to caste discrimination law, with the Conservative parties, plus it has key allies in the House of Lords that Kalpana mentioned, and we have the names of those people, obviously. And on the left-hand side, you've got the National Council of Hindu Temples and the Swaminarayan Mandirs here as well, and obviously the HSS. And closer to the private sector, you have Hindu Forum of Britain and City Hindus. There are obviously more, but these are the most prominent ones. So hopefully that leaves plenty of time for questions, and really keen to hear people's thoughts and have this space as a process for mutual learning. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Keval and Kalpana. You've given us, you've covered so much ground in such short time. So, and you have given us a lot of time to try and unpack some of the detail. We're reminding our participants to put their questions into the Q&A forum, and also to clearly indicate to us whether they would like to go on camera or they would like us to ask the question for them. We have one person ready to ask a question. So while I'm lining that up, we'll take questions in twos. Yeah, is that okay for both of you? So I'll just put a question in to get us started, and then Mudit, if you can get Harun on camera while I'm talking, can you give him Yeah, okay, thanks. Yeah, so I was really interested to sort of hear the genealogy of this Hindu phobia discourse. Kalpana, you began that discussion, and now Keval has fleshed out in quite some detail how it's operating today. What a highly organized and infinitely financed machinery is working to sort of promote this discourse and give it very real power, certainly in terms of the British political establishment. Would you like to elaborate on that a little bit about how, has anything changed in the way they're deploying this discourse from when they started and how they're using it now? Or is there something else you'd like to tell us about it that you didn't have time to talk to in your presentation? So that's one question. And I'd like to welcome the one and only Harun Kasim from the Humanism Project. Harun, please ask your question. Thank you.
Thanks, Kalpana and Keval. Look, I, like, Nisha said, we founded an organization called the Humanism Project 1 year ago. So we clearly do not have the breadth of the history that you do. And, we've been very inspired by your work, and, you need to get inspiration. Now, as far as Hindu phobia is concerned, interestingly, this talk is very timely because in Australia, there was actually an e-petition to ban Hindu phobia. And the wording of that was very interesting. The wording goes, ban use of any terminology that includes the terms Hindu, Hindutva, or Hinduism in relation to radicalization, religious extremism, or supremism, right? So we're writing a document on that. And the reason I talk about that is there are two ways of addressing that problem. You can go into the academic background of Hinduphobia, or just say it's an outright attack on free speech in Australia, which means that I can't, criticize Hindu. For instance, we had a Sikh attack now, so I can't call it Hindu radicals, and that becomes deeply problematic, and it appeals to the wider society, and that's something we've always done. For instance, about a month ago, we went to Multicultural New South Wales here, and we said these guys are creating social discord, not hate speech. And we framed the social discord as a community problem that included the Australian Federation of Islamic Councils, not just India, the Australians, right? And various others. So what that does is we were speaking from the position of a much wider base, right? Which forces politicians to take a stand. Just putting that in perspective in the UK context. So here the population of Hindus is about 4.5%. I think. In the UK, I just looked at the figures. The Hindus are about 1 million and odd today in the UK. The Sikhs constitute about 750,000, 250,000 in the Dalit community. You add the Muslims, you have a sizable electorate just among Indian Muslims and Indian Sikhs and Dalits. Now, if you were to frame this as a problem that affects the British society at large, not just the South Asian population, you just wonder if you might have more traction, and if that's something you would consider it. Because I very often, that's just a question. Have you considered framing it as a population?
Yeah, sorry, please complete the question. Sorry.
Yeah, so that's really a question. Whether we are very inward looking, and if we could, look out and make this an issue that affects the British society at large and strikes at the very fundamentals of a progressive democracy, right? That's how I frame it to my politicians here. Are we a democracy or not?
Shall I respond? Yeah, so thanks for those two really interesting questions, and thanks, Harun. I mean, we've also, been really, inspired by what the Humanism Project is doing in Australia over the last few years. And I mean, I think to come to your question first, I think, we've always, and I think, when I talked about our history as well, we've always been very much rooted in wider struggles in Britain, and particularly in building those sorts of alliances. And more recently, you know, I think, for example, I mentioned our conference on fascism, which I didn't get a chance to mention, but it was very much about looking at fascism globally. So we had, you know, speakers from, you know, really across the world. So people talking about Britain and the US under Trump at the time, talking about what's happening in Brazil, talking about Palestine, talking about, at the time we had people from the Sudanese revolution, which was going on. So we had, you know, those kinds of alliances, anti-imperialist alliances, for example, have been very important to the work we do throughout. And I think, yes, I mean, also we are South Asia Solidarity Group, so we always, you know, work beyond those boundaries, and that's kind of inherent in what we do. I think that I'm not sure if I completely understood your question. One of the things I did want to say is that in Britain, we have to be very careful about using terms like extremism and fundamentalism and so on. And we don't usually use those terms because that very much plays into you know, to the discourse, which is highly Islamophobic and which has been used. There are a whole lot of very repressive legislations which we have stood with Muslim communities and others in opposing. For example, we have the prevent legislation, which is, you know, you're probably aware of all the really abusive cases which have come out of that, but it's about particularly targets any kind of criticism of the war on terror or you know, imperialism in Muslim countries being raised in schools and universities. And, you know, there's, you know, literally children as young as 4 or 5 have come under that legislation. So in that context, we don't find that kind of terming or the use of kind of freedom of speech either particularly useful as a framing. Freedom of speech in Britain certainly has been very much a weapon of the far right, which is kind of being used now to kind of legitimize hate speech by the right. So I think these are kind of some of the complexities which we have to deal with. You know, we can't simply say these people are extremists, they are restricting freedom of speech and so on. And we found it more useful to talk about fascism and to sort of build a broader anti-fascist alliance. I think one of the ways that we have had some, you know, success in that is that now, you know, we hear Modi being kind of routinely listed whenever, you know, people you know, in political fora in Britain talk about the rise of the far right, the rise of fascism globally. And earlier that wasn't really happening. He wasn't really on the radar in the same way. So I think, you know, there's different strategies for different contexts, but I think, yeah, I think those are some of our experiences. And as far as Nisha, you were kind of asking about the evolution of this notion of Hinduphobia here. I mean, I think, you know, one of the things we're seeing most recently, I think we've Keval and I both talked about how, you know, it was kind of used as if by these Hindutva groups who are very aligned with the Conservative Party to attack the Labour Party and attack the left. But I think what's now happening is that they're also trying to, in a way, appeal to people who are progressive or people who are anti-racist, and actually sort of say, well, this is actually a form of day-to-day racism faced by Indians in Britain. And that is something which is actually very difficult for, you know, if, for example, a left-wing anti-racist MP is approached, and this has happened recently, to sign an early day motion against the racism faced specifically by Indians. And obviously it's almost impossible for them to say no to that. But then when you read the motion actually says the most important kind of racism faced by Indians is Hinduphobia, right? So what we're trying to do at the moment is to really give those people the tools to actually understand what Hinduphobia is, and that it's a kind of red flag, essentially, that if you see this mentioned, you're really going into something which is furthering the agenda of the far right. I think Keval can probably talk about the survey which was done by an organization which has been set up by Hindutva groups called the 1928 Committee, which is incredibly misleading and managed to sort of somehow generate this kind of some very spurious statistics around Hinduphobia. But I think, yeah, Keval, did you want to come in at all on this one?
Yeah, I can't remember the 1928 data too well, but I think it was something like 60% of respondents, or maybe even 80% of respondents, that they had found said that they had experienced Hinduphobia. So when we challenged them to ask them, so who were these respondents? They were essentially members of the Hindutva lobby. So they're producing data and producing it as research, and having an incredibly small sample, a biased sample, but presenting that in political spaces as authentic and carrying weight, unfortunately.
Thanks. Mudit, you had a question, and I don't think we have any other questions in the chat right now. So Mudit, you go, and then I have another question as well.
Yeah, I wanted to address the whole lack of understanding generally that the diaspora has in differentiating between decolonization and anti-colonialism. So I am a decolonization scholar, but I use it to study prejudices. I don't use it to study lived experiences of the oppressed. Largely though, I've seen in recent times, especially on Twitter, I've seen male Brahmin men coming and challenging ideas of decolonizing India, or decolonizing the caste system, or decolonizing our faiths, using ideas of anti-colonialism, saying that if you use ideas of decolonization, you are playing into North American white anthropology, and that is also very imposed on us, which is not true. Dr. Ambedkar built solidarities with Du Bois way before even India existed. So, and those were decolonizing ideas. So I think, yeah, if anybody is looking to understand this more, there is always literature that I can link you up with. But what equating decolonization and anti-colonialism does is it creates opportunities to diversity wash Indian conservatism in Western democracies. Like, for example, Rishi Sunak and Preeti Patel, they become diversity hires, and so then you can't question them in that case. So then how do you go about questioning such leaders or people or representatives who were settlers where they came from, and when they relocated to colonial Africa, they were settlers there, and they were neo-colonizers where they came from in India as upper caste people. So then how do you question them in Western democracies where they become people of color?
Mudit. We'd like you also to talk a little more about the nexus between capitalism and global Hindu nationalism and fascism. Both of you have referred to it multiple times in your short talk, but we'd like you to expand on what else do we need to understand that this isn't just a cultural political movement on the far right. And of course, Adani. Kalpana, you started off by acknowledging the anti-Adani struggles here. But yeah, we know you know a lot more about this. What is it, those of us who are engaging with them here, what is it people perhaps need to know more about yeah, the reason why this is as much an economic ideology as it is a political and a cultural ideology, right? So please, thank you.
I just wanted to, I think, Mudit raised some really interesting points for discussion. And in some ways, this is a kind of conversation which could be ongoing. I think one of the things that I wanted to say in response to that is that is that I think very often we the experience of the US is becomes universalized to the whole of the diaspora, and I think that's perhaps can be a bit problematic, and that's why I felt it was important to kind of trace some of the specific histories we have in the UK, where I would say that firstly, Dalit organizations, which are really very much here. Also kind of primarily working class organizations, have been active for a long time. And the caste legislation campaign which Keval talked about is not something new. It's something which has been going on for a long time, that campaign, and it's been spearheaded by Dalit organizations. I think also, the kind of, in the US, there's a kind of, idea that, well, the Indian community has been primarily, although I don't think this is even fully true in the US, but the idea that the Indian community has been primarily an elite, educated migrant community, right? Highly, professionals and so on. And that they are sort of like basically going into, a context of racism and trying to insert themselves into it as kind of, as you said, people of color. I think in Britain, the context is very different because, as I said, for many decades, Asians were kind of seen as homogenous South Asians, and they also had a great deal of solidarity. So there were many, many organizations which were not just ours, which were Asian organizations. There was the Asian Youth Movement, and there were many others. There was women's organizations like Awaz, the Asian Women's Organization. So I think, this is a very different context, and this included, Muslims, Sikhs, Dalits, in these organizations. Now, that's not to say, of course, that they weren't shot through with caste, that they weren't, that there weren't those hierarchies and questions there. But what I am saying is that there was a sense of the need to fight those things in a collective movement. And also that, these were not primarily ever, upper middle class professionals. And the migration of those people has been relatively small to the UK compared to the people who came as workers. And the people who are from that class now are often second or third generation, in fact. And they are becoming increasingly prominent. And there is this attempt to sort of now, which is very much spearheaded by the Hindutva groups, to represent South Indians in Britain as completely separate from other South Asians, who, of course, Muslims have been increasingly singled out and demonized by the British state. So to say that, it's Indians who are the model minority, very much following this American model. So, but we have to look at the fact that the history and the reality is somewhat different. And we also have, as I said, a very, very a large Sikh community, Punjabi Sikh community, which again now has been which has been mobilizing around post 1984, which is and is now very much engaged with the farmers movement, through direct connections with the people who are protesting in India. So there's all of those sorts of complexities. In terms of global capital and all of that. I mean, I think that's another really, really interesting and important discussion. I'm glad you've picked up on it. I think Keval has been working on some of this and can say more particularly about finance capital and its current role. I think we really need to look at the way in which now you have Indian capital, billionaires like Adani and Ambani being very much integrated into global capital, right? And playing, being part of imperialism in that sense, and I think that's very, I mean, in a broad sense, that's kind of a very important point to grasp. And the fact that Hindutva has now become completely integrated with the aims and objectives of those, so that when we talk about what is happening in India at the moment, we talk about the atrocities, we talk about the the oppressive laws which are basically disenfranchising Muslims and so on, but we also have to talk about the kind of corporate plunder which is going on. We have to talk about the dispossession of our Adivasi communities. We have to talk about the environmental destruction which is going on in Chhattisgarh and Jharkhand and elsewhere. And we have to link these things as well. So, for example, the fact that the dispossession going on in Assam at the moment is also linked to the interest in palm oil plantations. It's linked to the land question and corporate land grab. So there are a lot of ways in which we need to keep on making those connections and go beyond a kind of go beyond this idea that Hindutva is some kind of simply a kind of majoritarianism. And certainly it's not a nationalism, because in fact, there is no economic nationalist content in the policies of the Modi government, right? They're absolutely happy to sell off, the country to have it plundered by corporate capital, both Indian and foreign.
Yeah. I mean, there's not much, more to add beyond this becoming a completely separate webinar, which I hope we can do actually on Hindutva, global capital and fascism. Because one thing that we have to use is historical materialism in our work. We can't just ignore the material fact, the development of class societies, what's happened through colonialism and through imperialism, to get to the present day kind of political economy that we live in. If we did that, then we'd realize the limitations of things like freedom of speech and diversity measures and multiculturalism measures. We'd see that that's actually entirely within sort of the softer end of liberal capitalism. And we have to make these demarcations between capital and anti-capital, because they very much feed into, as Kalpana was saying, which is a universal ideology of power and capital. And however that manifests differently in different spaces. In India, it's Hindutva fascism, but it's coming back to global capital. If you think about the way in which Indian companies are financed, we've done some research and realized that many British banks are still paying for the financing of coal plants in Asia, including India. And this is, despite them attending COP26 in Glasgow, talking about green credentials. So there is this project of greenwashing and whitewashing. So, if you have a historical materialist lens to this work, you'd realize that the utter nonsense that is going on within liberal spaces, within COP26, even within the idea of black or brown capitalism, leveling up agendas, the idea of having black and brown faces purely in imperial spaces is not emancipatory at all. It's very much a continuation of existing power structures. I mean, we could go on more, but maybe there's other questions. But I think, you know, it's important, I think, to demarcate ourselves in through that sort of lens.
Thank you, and we accept your offer to come back and do another webinar for us on global capital and Hindutva. So we have a question from South Asia Times. There is little warmness between Dalit and anti-capitalist activists. Why? Thank you, South Asia Times. And the second question is, have you noticed any gendered dimensions to the way you know, the Hindutva machinery operates in the UK? You know, Kalpana, this is your area, but and of course we know that there's a long gendered discourse of Hindu nationalism. This is, as you said, about Brahmanism, but it's also about patriarchy. So any thoughts you have on the gendered operations of this machinery in your context? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of this whole question of, you know, Dalit politics and Ambedkarite politics and anti-capitalist politics, Marxist politics, you know, this is a whole area, and obviously there are differences. But I think we also have to recognize that you know, we can't pigeonhole Dalit activists in that way as being kind of, you know, monolithically, you know, uninterested in anti-capitalist struggles. I think there's a very strong engagement which is going on, where, you know, I think that it's also like assuming in a way that Dalits are not part of anti-capitalist struggles, which I find very problematic, because, for example, when we look at the actual Indian context, you know, it is, and, you know, I started off talking, I think, you know, probably, you know, it's a long time ago now, but like I mentioned the, you know, how we worked and continue to work with movements in Bihar, where, you know, these are actually left-led movements where the leadership and the people who are actually engaging in those struggles are largely Dalits and oppressed castes. And they are, you know, so this is, you know, it's not like an either or, you know, there are a whole spectrum of positions. And, you know, those people are both committed to an anti-caste politics, and they are committed to a revolutionary approach to you know, the abolition of capitalism as well. You know, they're and this is a struggle which has been going on for decades. So I think, you know, we have to also recognize the breadth of politics around around this, you know, and we can see in India the rise of kind of you know, definitely the growth of a direct engagement between communism and Ambedkarism, and this is something that I think we should also recognize. I'm not saying that those contradictions are not there, but I think it's something that we should also recognize, rather than having a kind of narrow understanding of who represents each of these strands of politics which the person asking the question identified. I think, yes, I mean, I think the question of gender is certainly very, very important. I think, you know, they are, you know, very active in, sorry, and also I think for the previous question, I just also wanted to mention about Adivasi communities who are at the forefront really in India of fighting capitalism. I mean, So we can't think about the Indian resistance to corporate capital, to dispossession, to corporate plunder, to mining, to the destruction of the environment without seeing that it is Adivasi communities, Adivasi thinkers, Adivasi activists who are at the forefront of that. The other thing, about gender, I mean, I think, it's very much been, Hindutva is, of course, a deeply patriarchal ideology, right? And, just as in India, we've seen this, I mentioned about this, this claim that, as they put it, Hindu and Sikh girls were undergoing forced conversion by Muslims. Now, what the reality of this, of course, is, trying to terrorize those who engage in interfaith consensual relationships. And this is something that we're seeing here as well, and also intercaste relationships. So I think that is something which, we are also seeing here in terms of the attempts to prevent such relationships, attempts to prevent, disrupt such marriages and so on. These things have happened. And, it's also happened through the women's organizations, which the Hindutva groups have set up, So they're often, in fact, some of the most virulent kind of promoters of these patriarchal ideas, and talking about, women shouldn't be leaving violent relationships because, it's our culture to adjust and to find ways to make it work and all the rest of it. They have made attempts to sort of enter the domestic violence sector. We have a whole lot of women's refuges, including Black and minority ethnic women's refuges in Britain, although those refuges are very much have faced huge cuts in their funding and are struggling to survive. And they have tried to sort of enter that sector, not very successfully so far, because there is a very strong Black and Asian feminist movement, which is kind of really, occupying those spaces. But yeah, that's certainly very interesting, and I'd like to know more from you, Nisha, about the work you've been doing.
Yeah, I think I've got nothing to add to those two questions that Kalpana hasn't already said.
Okay, thanks. Maybe ask you one last question and then we'll let you go. Mudit has one last question for you. Thanks, Mudit.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, what is the significance of an Indian origin Home Secretary introducing in the UK a points-based skilled migration system and doing away with concrete policies around taking in the displaced and the refugees?
Keval, did you want to maybe respond first on that and talk a bit more about Preeti Patel?
I've just got one ear on our plumber. Would you mind doing that?
Sorry. Yeah, no, I know what it's like. Yeah, so I mean, Preeti Patel has been very much, I mean, she's perhaps, the most kind of openly racist and anti-migrant in the current cabinet. I mean, her role as Home Secretary anyway is to kind of put across the, policies on migration. And she's, definitely, she's, her most recent thing, for example, has been to say that, the authorities cannot be prosecuted for causing the deaths of refugees who are trying to enter the country. So this is referring to the people attempting to cross by sea. in particular, many of whom, as we know, have been drowned. And so, this is Preeti Patel. She's also very much a kind of very open ally of the RSS. She's talked about how much she admires the RSS. She's spoken at their functions and so on. And she's also very close to Israel. So in a way, she kind of epitomizes what Hindutva represents and the way they operate in Britain. And very much feeding into this sort of, whipping up of both Islamophobia as well as anti-Black racism. She's very much been at the forefront of, for example, the new policing bill, which, will basically is targeting Black Lives Matter protesters, it's targeting environmental protesters, it's targeting feminist protesters who have been, had massive demonstrations against rape for the recent cases, including that of Sarah Everard, who was murdered by a serving police man. So, I mean, that's Preeti Patel. As far as the points-based immigration system goes, this is very much this idea of creating an idea that, only some migrants are, I won't even say valued, I'd say human.
Merit, the idea of merit, I guess.
Yeah. So they have merit because, the idea is that they can contribute, and others who are actually keeping the economy going on a day-to-day basis in precarious jobs and so on, they are assumed to have no value, right? I mean, I think as far as the points-based system is concerned, it's also a fact that you still have people. In fact, you have a new sort of phase where people in smaller numbers but are still migrating from India outside of these formal structures, right? So people are still migrating and coming here who are not from those elite backgrounds, who are not necessarily upper caste either, and who don't have those supposedly valued qualifications and professional skills. They are people who are coming, who are, for example, being involved in working for Deliveroo, which is it's a food delivery service, part of the gig economy, where they're working as riders on motorcycles and bicycles. And recently, just a couple of years ago, there was actually a very successful strike, which was primarily engaged in by Indian delivery workers against a further attack on their conditions, and the company had to back down. So these there's people coming to there have been people coming to pick fruits in farms in England from Punjab, but this is all kind of happening below the radar invisibly. And then on the other hand, so in a way, the points-based system is, I think, primarily it's a rhetorical device to devalue the labor and the lives of those who are excluded from it. Yeah, I don't know if that really answers it, but it does.
It essentially comes from two settler colonies, which are Australia and Canada, which have championed the cause of that kind of system, settlerism. So but the answer was pretty much, it covered basically everything.
It's also a way of undermining the labor movement, isn't it? And I know we're out of time, and I'm just thinking a question we should have asked is, where does the traditional labor movement, I mean, what has been your experience of allyship with the traditional labor movement? Because you had that lovely photo, Kalpana, of when the miners showed up in the 70s, right? But they show up today. But I mean, do you want to sort of take that one?
I mean, very briefly, I think that I mean, the story of that Grunwick strike, of course, there was that grassroots tremendous solidarity from the labor movement at that time. But the labor movement leadership, the trade union leadership, was extremely racist and sexist, and really ultimately betrayed those workers and backed down. And so it wasn't a very, a happy ending to that story. And I think that that it has been a struggle from below for, for South Asian workers to get any kind of recognition from the trade unions, to get the trade unions to take up their struggles. And when I said we're involved in supporting various groups of Asian women workers, a lot of that was really about pushing the trade union bureaucracy to take up those questions. But I mean, it's also been important because, I think most of the you've got now, for example, new trade unions coming up, which are basically specifically working with those in precarious jobs who are majority migrants, in fact, and those are doing really, really important work as well. And you have, for example, organizing domestic workers, which also includes South Asian women, organizing precarious workers like cleaners in universities, for example. That's been a very big thing. And many of them are Latin American or African, and many of them actually bring a lot of, a whole wealth of political organizing from the places from which they've come. So, there's a lot of different things going on, and you talk about the trade union movement in Britain. But yes, I think that's also been important for us, for example, just in terms of, getting, for example, motions passed in trade unions, condemning, what's been happening, what's being done by the Modi government, condemning, this new phase of settler colonialism in Kashmir, for example, and taking those kinds of positions and stands, condemning the CAA. And those are important sort of ways of also on that kind of level of sort of solidarity building. So yeah, the trade union question is really important one.
Thank you so much. We're out of time, so we'll stop here. But we thank you for giving us such a rich, complex analysis of what's going on. And of course, with historicized, with global and local sort of. Always linking the global to the local. We very much hope, to keep in touch, to continue the conversation. On another side note, some of us are working on, we're sort of sending out feelers to trade unions here. And it's been quite alarming to sort of hear back from them that not only are they unaware of something like caste oppression, but I mean, generally there's India literacy is very poor here in Australia, and there are all these really problematic racialized imaginaries and representations of, exotic India, which is where you go for yoga and curry, chicken butter masala, and I don't know, maybe Bollywood now. And so, yeah, so look, there's so much we have to talk about. We're so pleased and honored to have you with us today. So thanks, you guys. Stay well, take care of yourselves, and we'll be in touch. And to our participants, thank you everyone for joining us on a Saturday, and watch this space. We'll be in touch with more programming. Thank you, everyone.
हम देखेंगे लाजिम है कि हम भी देखेंगे हम देखेंगे लाजिम है कि हम भी देखेंगे हम देखेंगे हम देखेंगे वो दिन क्या जिसका वादा है, जो औले अज़ल में लिखा है, हम देखेंगे, हम देखेंगे।